It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter for the day first. Hui-chi Hsu is Associate Professor in the Department of History at Tsinghua University in Taiwan. Even though I realized she was introduced yesterday, I'm just going to go with the format here anyway because I can just, or on Monday. She received her PhD in history from National Tsinghua University in Taiwan and is also currently pursuing a second PhD in transnational and U.S. history from Johns Hopkins. She is therefore currently at work on her second dissertation. Let's just take a moment to process the psychic weight of that. About Emma Goldman's anarchist journal, Mother Earth, which Hsu analyzes in a particularly transnational context. Her first dissertation interrogated the construction of the new woman in cross-cultural perspectives. And her attention to the gendered production of modernity has already yielded 2 books, including her most recent, New Looks of Ancient Capital, Urban Consumption of Beijing from 1928 to 1937, which came out in 2008. I'm speaking quickly, don't worry. And Nora in China, The Image Making and Evolution of the New Woman, 1900s to 1930s, which came out in 2003. She has managed to secure an impressive line of research grants from the National Science Council of Taiwan every year from 2002 to 2009. Her research, I need to know what the magic spell is. Her research has also been supported by the Fulbright Foundation and the Toyota Foundation. She asked me to keep it brief, so I'm going to move on to our first respondent, Willey, who joins us from the Pioneer Valley, just south of the Upper Valley in western Massachusetts, where she is a 5 College Assistant Professor of Feminist Science Studies, where she chairs the Feminist Science and Technology Studies Initiative. So what that really means for people who are not familiar with the 5 College system is that her institutional home may be at UMass Amherst, but she also teaches at the other 5 colleges, including Mount Holyoke and Hampshire.
I only teach at Mount Holyoke, Hampshire, and UMass. I don't teach at Smith or, what's the other one? Amherst. Only 3.
Right, only 3. Willey received her PhD in Women's Studies from Emory in 2010 and also holds a master's degree in Gender Studies from the London School of Economics, which I'd like to hear more about at some point. She's therefore part of a generation that has been trained in women's and gender studies as an interdiscipline of its own right, with its own internal tensions and multiple sets of overlapping but still partial and selective theoretical frameworks. Her book manuscript, Monogamy, The Politics of Science and the Possibilities of Biology, has brought her multidisciplinary analytics and methodologies to bear on the question of how monogamy gets produced and reified in the laboratory, the classroom, and popular scientific discourse, and how, also, importantly, we might rethink the sexual body. In addition to her work this summer here at the Institute, Willey is also currently engaged in an intensive reading group that brings Spivak and Haraway into more direct conversation. After her time here at Dartmouth, she'll be moving on to a fellowship year at Rice University, where the Humanities Research Center has put together a theme of materialism and new materialism across the disciplines. In my preparation for this introduction, I was overwhelmed, though not surprised, by the number of research grants Angie has won from the MacMillan Foundation and various humanities institutes, as well as the many teaching accolades that she's garnered. The other remarkable part of reading through her CV, though, is this clear dedication to feminist mentorship practices. So in this sense, she's truly sort of an academic triple threat, right? Rigorous researcher, inspiring teacher, and all-around generous and amiable interlocutor. Kurt MacMillan, I've already clearly become fond of her, but she's also the one who has not formally been introduced at this table, so I thought I'd spend a little time. Kurt MacMillan, one of our resident Latin Americanists, recently completed his PhD in history from UC Irvine, where he successfully defended his stellar dissertation, Hormonal Bodies, Sex, Race, and Constitutional Medicine in the Iberian-American World, 1900 to 1950. Although at some point you had an earlier title that involved the word transregional. I'm interested about that. MacMillan's inquiry into the relationships among gender, science, and historical explorations of sexology in modern Latin America brought him to conduct archival research in not just 1 or 2 archives, but in 3 different countries, in Spain, Ecuador, and Chile, where he investigated the oeuvres of 3 early 20th century intellectual figures and their research in the emerging field of constitutional medicine. MacMillan's research has been supported by various institutions, including the Social Science Research Council, the UC Irvine Humanities Center, which is one of, if you don't know, one of the most formidable and exciting humanities institutes, I think, in the nation right now, and with huge thanks to David Theo Goldberg. This is going on record, right? For sort of almost single-handedly saving the humanities and UC system, but maybe that's an overblown narrative. Where am I? And the Philadelphia Area Center for History of Science and the Latin American School of Social Science in Quito. His training extends beyond his graduate work at UC Irvine to his work as museum assistant for 3 years at the Princeton University Art Museum, as curatorial intern at El Museo del Barrio in New York City, as well as archival assistant in the special collections and archives at UC Irvine. I don't know if you can tell that I covet those archival skills. Kurt is a very exciting emerging scholar whose work always brings together a keen set of theoretical frameworks and interdisciplinary approaches to examine the relations between medical science and the discourses of race, gender, and sex. And I am looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today very much. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Aimee, and good afternoon, everyone. Please allow me to, again, to express my genuine gratitude to be able to be accepted by the Institute. And also, I really would like to apologize for many things. First of all, I extremely oversee the word limit. Please excuse me for that because I really was working like crazy to finish this essay. So also the grammar or the typo or everything. And so just please bear with me about that. And this is really a draft. And even though it's only, I think my own self-defense is that this is a draft that actually is a little bit different from maybe other of yours draft in terms of that actually, I have to confess, I haven't really studied this field for 4 years, for 3 to 4 years. So this is a distant. I mean, maybe you can understand in a way. I'm not trying to really defend. So also, it's bad, so it's alright. It's not like that. but I just want to say, most of the draft most of the content in this draft that now you have read actually were produced after I came here, and so I really some of the if you already opened Angie's first page, her draft, you can see she has a short letter to all of us, and I really think that except for that I'm a historian, many parts of her explanation kind of applied to me, so applied to my draft. So it's really, I really didn't have time to, when I start writing and I didn't have time to go back. So I can surely, it's totally possible that I might have, I don't know even, do I have conflicting ideas or do I have like some arguments are not very well developed. So I'm very, very looking forward to all the comments, questions, and advices about this draft. So today that I can receive. And so now, I guess what I have been thinking, well, of course, actually, Doug and Veronica know a bit more about my struggle because everything actually started after I read Howard Jones' article. Because the very original version 4 years ago is a Chinese conference paper, and it actually now is really being left maybe like 10%. So at that time, John's article was not published yet. So I haven't got the chance to read his article. So the first week when I'm really very grateful to be able to read his article. So you can see that I tried to dialogue and maybe kind of like revise a bit of his epistemic modernity, this idea, and the strategy I adopted so far is to try to argue that actually there are differences, transformation in the time periods, the shift. And so far as I can tell, no, of course I might be wrong, but so far I can tell it seems like no scholarship has really dealt with this. I called it like a more nuanced understanding of this so-called epistemic transformation in the so-called Republican period from 1910s to 1940s, but mainly they are focusing on 1910s to 1930s because after 37 it's already the Second World War. So like how article, he kind of treating that period as a block. And what I find is actually, I think my discovery, if you can call it a discovery, actually was led by my reading, further reading of Zhang Jingsheng and Pan Wangdan's, the difference, which when I read Harold's article, it seems to be a blow because we deal practically the same actor to me. But of course, he didn't really talk about Zhou Zuoren and talk about, and of course, again, his focus is not about the translation of Havelock Ellis's works. But at that time, when I read his article, I really feel like, oh, what else can I do? So that's why I decided to focus on the translation, because actually the previous 4 years ago, I was not just talking about translation. So by doing that, and then maybe you can also tell that I try to apply some, again, maybe very immaturely, some idea about translation to help me read, read the so-called original text and then the translated text. And then I try to differentiate or characterize different types of translation that I can, so far I can find in the translation works of Havelock Ellis's in China. So that is kind of what I tried to do in the past 2 weeks. And actually the first week, because I have to submit that in July the 8th. So that's kind of, I don't want to go over again of the points that I've already tried to make in my paper. So I just want to, I just want to say, try to point out that maybe, hopefully, in my revised essay, I can again try to highlight that part, because I really think actually I would like to highlight the significance or importance of these so-called periodization in terms of to look further into this reception and translation of foreign works into the so-called Republican China, where maybe most scholars have already, in a way, more or less recognized that there was a shift. The so-called, Paul using his term is as epistemic transformation. But what exactly had happened during that time period? I hope my this study, it can be a good case study, a good entry point into exploring a bit further and try to use Havelock Ellis's works, the translations, and to kind of open up another, maybe, just a further step to this. So that's what I want to say. And if I cannot, I would really love to hear any kinds of questions, and please again excuse me if I cannot answer them, but I promise I will take them all back and try to digest and to help me revise my paper. Thank you very much.
Rachel, I'm so delighted to be a respondent on the paper. Thanks to Veronica and Doug for giving us the structured opportunity to connect in this way. I found the paper really engaging. It was full of information that was really new to me, and it was really interesting to read it in light of having just read Cheng's work. Let's see. I really admire the way you work to thematize messiness. It's clear to me from reading your paper that Chinese translations of Ellis did different kinds of work, and that their texts can and should be thought of differently in their relationships to modernity, and further, that this focus on the heterogeneity of translations can indeed tell us something about the emergence of sexuality in China, and about how we conceptualize transnational sexual science in general. It was very helpful to me to have an exchange with you over email in the last few days and learn that you've recently begun rewriting the paper in light of Cheng's work on epistemic modernity. Toward the end of the paper, on page 24, you say that your analysis of a generational shift in the nature of Chinese intellectuals' engagement with English language texts can help to refine Chang's concept of epistemic modernity. This aspect of your project, or perhaps this emerging direction in your analysis, guides most of my queries for you here. The overarching frame of my questions is what I perceive as a tension in this version of the paper between a story of messiness and multiplicity and one that presents the translations as a whole as doing one kind of cultural work. All of the translations may be part of what you call modernizing elites' arsenal for challenging Confucian models of patriarchal dominance, female subjugation, and familial hierarchy. But how did their differences from one another matter in terms of thematizing, theorizing, or upsetting those models? You also describe in the introduction, in the middle of the first paragraph, that Confucianism came under attack by liberals and radicals as the main hindrance to individualism, egalitarianism, democracy, and scientific development. You seem in this introduction to be implicitly charting a conflation here of this first set of things and the second set of things, between challenging patriarchal dominance, female subjugation, and familial hierarchy on the one hand, and promoting individualism, egalitarianism, democracy, and science on the other. I'd like to hear you say more about the relationship between that former and latter set of shared concerns. Perhaps to make it more manageable, the link between the former set, patriarchy and female subjugation and familial hierarchy and science, or about assumptions between the relationship of science to democracy. I think those are both things that you could sort of unpack there that would be helpful. On the bottom of page 2, you articulate what I take to be a partial articulation of your thesis. So you say the entry of Havelock Ellis's works and thoughts into modern China, as I will argue in this paper, duly showcases the ways in which Chinese readers encountered, received, and adapted Western sexual science to serve their versions and visions of sexual science. I like this versions and visions. It really conjures this messiness. And I want to see the stakes developed more through the paper and articulated here in the beginning. So let us know what the narrative, this narrative of messiness confounds or elaborates in Chang's articulation of epistemic modernity. In the rest of my comments, I'll point to a few specific places where I think that development could happen. Sometimes just by adding a sentence or two, and sometimes maybe in a bigger way. So you say that coincidentally, all of the translators had foreign training. And I don't know enough about the context to know if that's surprising, and I wasn't sure how it's a coincidence. I don't know. So I needed more information to make that make sense. And then, so you sort of leave that similarity alone and leave it as a coincidence, and then move on to the differences. And I thought the differences in the training of the translators feels really important for your paper, and could be made a lot more of. So I need help pronouncing these names. Z-H-O-U?
周作人, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I guess so.
Joe?
Yes,
Okay.
Zhou.
With training in civil engineering and lit, and then Zhang?
Yeah.
Zhang? Z-H-A-N-G.
Zhang.
Zhang? In philosophy, and then
Pan.
in biology, eugenics, genetics, and zoology. And then, as a quick side note before I move on, I wanted to say I thought it was interesting that you list as Penn's training both genetics and eugenics. I wanted a footnote on that. So we could talk more about it, but it does interesting work in that sentence where the eugenics places him in a particular history, that makes us think of him in a particular way, then listing genetics as something separate sort of legitimizes his work in a particular way, does some epistemic work there. Let's see. So I wanted to know what difference their training made to their approaches and or the reception of their work in terms of their claims to the epistemic authority of science and in terms of their representations and embodiment of sexology as an emerging field in China. Among translators, you say there was a sense of homogeneity around what the problems were in China. I needed a much better sense of what these were. So I don't know if other people felt that way, but I wanted a little bit more. And then to know how, despite this homogeneity, there were these quite noteworthy differences in approach. So I wanted to understand what was the same better first. I found myself particularly interested in Z-H-A-N-G.
Yes, John.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I should have called you last night. Zhang's failures at making sexology respectable, which you talk about on page 21. And on page 26, you begin describing some of the ways that Han disagreed with Ellis. I gather that this is different from how Zhang was just adding things like the third kind of water and the breathing. Since Han claims scientific authority for himself, rather than representing the ideas as belonging to Ellis, but I wanted to understand a lot more about this distinction because it felt really important for the bigger argument. How am I on time? Okay, on the bottom of page 3, you say, on the bottom of page 3, you say, not only will I explore the ways in which translation in various styles and senses significantly paved the way for the making of Chinese sexual science, I also suggest that the study of translating Western sexual science in China illuminates the diversity and mobility of translation as a means of regeneration for this ancient nation. I wanted you to define almost all the words in that second sentence. This is my training. I'm not a historian. Okay, so what do you mean by diversity, mobility, regeneration? And, you know, so what is translation doing? Okay, I have 2 minutes, so, okay. So I wanted more upfront about what you're getting at in comparing these translations. Why? What are the stakes? What is looking at the variety of translations? Why is looking at the variety of these translations, as you say, essential for comprehending the transnational history of sexual science? I was compelled, but I felt like I was working too hard for it. I want to pull it out a little bit more. On another note, there are some slippages in the first section on Ellis. Between your analysis of how Ellis and his work are between your actual analysis, and how Ellis and his work are normally understood. So you describe Ellis's approach as an essentialist tolerance, which I thought was really interesting to unpack a bit. I think we tend to think of biological determinism as always more dangerous than other explanatory regimes for difference, and there's not enough analysis, I think, that's often implied in the possibilities for freedom sometimes opened up by the idea of congenital difference in a homophobic context. So you seem to suggest that this is the case here and that Ellis's essentialism is deployed in at least some potentially useful ways. So I wanted to hear more about that. And that's again connecting the translations to the problems that you said everyone shared in common. So you say at the bottom of page 7 and onto page 8 that Ellis's methodology resulted in an objective narrative and fair generalization, and this is one of the places where I felt like that. Basically, I'd like to see you develop your analysis of Ellis's rhetoric around expertise, basically what I'm getting at. So his rhetoric around expertise, respectability, and the seriousness of sexology, I'd like to see that developed vis-a-vis each translator's relationship to that authority as producers of Chinese discourses on sexuality that may or may not be seen as scientific. So I'll leave it at that since and I will send you. I really enjoyed it.
just wanted to say that I really thoroughly enjoyed reading your paper. And although you call it a draft, it did not feel like a draft at all. It felt very
That's right.
refined, and it had a real narrative flow that kept me reading and really interested throughout. So I just have a series of specific questions and then a broader reading of your argument. And mine will be more historical in nature, but they touch on a lot of the same ideas and questions of Angie. So first, building on Michiko Suzuki's lecture yesterday about the intersection of sexological discourse and feminism in Japan during the early 20th century, I wanted to hear more about the Ladies' Journal and its role in the dissemination of Ellis's ideas in China. What kind of readership did it have? Was it a feminist publication? Also, since Zhou Jianren translated Ellis into Japanese, from Japanese to Chinese, and Zhou Zuoren studied in Japan, did they have ties to Japanese sexology and Japanese feminism? I'm also wondering, because you mentioned that Chinese translators were also interested in Ellen Key and Edward Carpenter, who were key figures in Michiko Suzuki's study. Is there also a Tokyo-Shanghai connection for the dissemination of sexological ideas during this period? Do Zhou Jianren, Zhou Zuoren, Zhang Jingsheng, and Pan Guangdan all work in Shanghai? I know. That's why it's good to go second. Are all of them working in Shanghai while they are working on Ellis translations? Second, you mentioned that Pan Guangdan studied biology, eugenics, genetics, and zoology in the U.S. At Dartmouth?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay.
He studies undergraduate.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Yeah, does he have any specific connections to the American eugenics movement? The combination of the disciplines that he studied made me wonder if he potentially had ties to the Carnegie Institution of Washington and the Eugenics Record Office that were based in Cold Spring Harbor, New York, from the 1910s to the 1940s, led by Charles Davenport, so that's a yes.
That is one of his mentors.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, then moving on third, I want to know more about sex reform in China during the New Culture movement and the post-May 4th generation. In this regard, I might suggest decentering Ellis as you revise your paper. He gets 4.5 pages near the beginning of the paper where there's only a short paragraph about the New Culture movement and 1 page about the post-May 4th generation. And I'm fascinated by your case studies of Ellis's translators, and I think that instead of giving us the Ellis summary, you could just deploy him when necessary in each case of the translator.
You mean, for example, like giving examples?
Right, or just what are they actually picking up from
Yes,
him?
yes.
And then I also think your argument about the role of attitude in the translation of Ellis and sexological knowledge in China could be made more prominent, particularly the idea that attitudes shaped styles of translation. And just where the argument stands so far, you're sort of drawn initially to how sexology is established as a discipline in China, as well as how did sexology modernize ideas about sex in China. And I think more often than not, you're talking, at least in my reading, you're talking about how the attitudes of the translators towards Ellis's work and sexology shape their translations. At the same time, I think there's several tensions around the theme of attitude in your paper. First, by making Ellis and his work the underlying object of study, it sets up an expectation of how faithful the Chinese translators were to Ellis's intentions, when it's really, I think, the strategic appropriation of Ellis's work in a specifically Chinese historical context that is the really rich avenue of analysis. When it comes to describing the attitudes of Ellis and his translators, here are some of the adjectives that I picked up on. For Ellis, he's interested in maintaining the gravity and respectability of sexology, and that to be a sexologist not only requires certain experiences and training, but also a certain personal disposition. And that Ellis writes for an audience of specialists, and that he is sincere, self-assured, discreet, and prudent. Zhou Zuoren, who's tapping into Ellis as a source of moral enlightenment on sex, gender, and morality in China, approaches Ellis's work with caution and genuine appreciation. He wrote for sound-minded adults who had healthy knowledge, comprehensive understanding, independent judgment, and responsibility, and he even goes into that contrast of who is a superior versus an inferior man. Also, Zhang Jingshen, his approach seems indiscreet and sensational. His citations are capricious and speculative. He flouts and inverts the intent of Ellis's work. And he foregrounds Ellis's sex psychology for a popular audience in China. And you also point out that he has a hybrid approach to sexology as both a scientific and artistic endeavor, which you describe as being ambiguous, confusing, and dubious. And then finally, with Pan Guangdan, he writes full translations of the text. He's professional, painstaking, refined, reserved, careful, comprehensive, exacting, and he mediates Ellis with his own Chinese point of view, distinct from other May 4th intellectuals. And then where this leads, it seems like at the end of the paper, you perhaps intentionally or unintentionally give Pan the award for scientific authority in sexology. And I'm wondering, however, to what extent your characterizations of the attitudes of these figures might reproduce tensions between Pan and Zhang, as well as tensions between May 4th and post-May 4th intellectuals. It seems like Pan's claim to sexual authority is strongly premised on disavowing the work of Dr. Sex. And also there's the fact that the form of Ellis's translation goes from anecdotal evidence or anecdotal fragments to biography to case studies to full text. There's kind of perhaps like a meta-narrative that's happening here in terms of attitude and style of translation that implicitly favors Pan. And here I think your authorial voice needs to be a little bit clearer, because sometimes I feel like, is this Pan's reading or is this your reading? You also note how Pan positioned himself as having a good Confucian upbringing that underwrote his support for conservative sexual morality over Ellis's, quote, individualistic and somewhat hedonistic goals. And this made me wonder about the relationship between Confucianism and Western science. Was a Confucian gentleman supposed to tell the truth, and if so, through what kinds of practices? And how does Confucian identity affect the reception of Western science in China? And here I'm also thinking a little bit about the work of Stephen Shapin, his book, A Social History of Truth, Civility and Science in 17th Century England, where Shapin points out how the production of scientific truth in the scientific revolution in England was not just about embracing the scientific method and Cartesian metaphysics, but for English scientists like Robert Boyle and Robert Hooke, it was about embodying gentility and civility as an English gentleman. And it was about following a secular code based on feudal traditions. There was some secular humanism, there was some Christian virtue, all mixed in together that is what legitimates you as a figure who can tell the truth. And so I'm wondering here, are there parallels with Confucian civil codes that might be at work in the reception and translation of Ellis's work? And in this sense, how modern is Pan? Because he seems to be post May 4th, yet he's returning to the Confucian tradition. And so how can we think of this figure of the modernized intellectual from a Confucian lens? And then finally, picking up on the ambiguity in Zhang's work, how does his work, Sex Histories, relate to erotic art and erotic literature in China? Is Zhang a simultaneous translator of sexual confessions into scientific case studies and erotic literature? Does he play with pornographic conventions in China? And also, how is his position as Dr. Sex produced? And what might that mean to the category of a modernized intellectual in China during this period? So I'll leave it there.